If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the Masquerade. In this episode, I shall rank the main 13 Laibon Legacies in Kindred of the Ebony Kingdom in what I consider to be the best and worst across all editions. In the previous episode of this podcast, I presented the 17 bloodlines in Vampire the Masquerade from worst to best in what I consider the ultimate list. Whilst it has been entertaining fiction reading your opinions on YouTube, we all know that you are wasting your energy, for my list cannot be topped. Ha 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 ha! Ha! I also suggested the idea I would carry on the lazy trend of doing lists but with the Laibon, whether you asked for it or not. Similar to previous lists, I will be referring to the material that has provided us information about the vampires of Africa in the World of Darkness, which, at the recording of this episode, is the revised edition sourcebook, Kindred of the Ebony Kingdom, Vampire the Dark Ages 20th Anniversary Edition, and Beckett's Jihad Diary. I will note that I will not include the Malkavians, the Ventrue, or followers of Set for two reasons. First, I discussed my thoughts and opinions already in a previous list-related episode, as their inclusion here is mostly unchanged. However, their additions are also remarkably racist and problematic, and I do not want to give that any more attention than it deserves. And I also wish to reiterate that all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I've said, that is totally fine. It does not mean, however, that you are right and I am wrong, and vice versa. Number 13. The Osibo Legacy. I should like the Osibo. Lore-wise, they are a strange blend between Bruja and anti-tribute Bruja, who understand they cannot go running about doing their own thing, lest they become savages. However, if you think a bit harder, this entire way of thinking and the type of person it has been presented upon, and you can quickly see how this writing is rather racist. Of course, this is not the entire ethos of the Osibo, as I waffled about in great detail in previous episodes on the Laibon, but I am still turned off by them all the same. I rate this legacy hangry again out of 10. Number 12. The Istari Legacy. An offshoot of the Toreador clan should be much higher than it currently is. I shouldn't be putting them near the bottom? Well, it is, so deal with it. The problem that most of the Laibon have is that, for one reason or another, they lack any interesting development beyond their source material. It is really expected for players to do their own research as well as the information provided within this book. A lot of this is easier now than it was upon the book's release, as the internet is now a thing, and one can locate the source material for the creation of each of the bloodlines quite easily. Now, some are easier than others to locate and pull interesting ideas from various cultures and beliefs. The Istari are not one of them. Yes, with a bit of creative thought, one can look at the weakness and conjure an interesting antagonist for players, but I do not feel inspired by the blend of the Ravno and Toreador clans that make up the Istari existence a very enticing experience. I rate this legacy fat bastard out of 10. Number 11. The Nakulu Zao Legacy. Again, a variant of a favourite bloodline of mine should not be this low down, but yet Africa's Salubri are just boringly angsty. They differ enough from the main offshoot and anti-tribute to almost be interesting, but I have very little to add to sell them to you. They are just boring. I rate this legacy Salubri defect out of 10. Number 10. The Shango Legacy. Exploring the lore of the Shango was an interesting one, as most of my resources pulled from existing information of the god of the same namesake. Unfortunately, their real-world influences is where the interesting qualities end. Whilst being a much simpler variant of the Assamite clan, which can make them more accessible for players, the requirement to have a selection of older books to fully implement Do-Un-Ki makes them a bit more of an awkward legacy to fumble with. I rate this legacy, I am the law, out of 10. Number 9. The Kinyonyi Legacy. There is very little reasons for me to like the Kinyonyi more than the Ravnos proper. Their purpose for travel is because they are now mercenaries, which is far more practical and useful to Africa's vampire society as a whole, sure, but it does not make them any more interesting in my honest opinion. I will admit that I like the changes to chemistry mentioned here, which adds to their deceptive natures. This does add some interesting cultural flavour, for lack of a better phrase. I rate this legacy tactical espionage action, out of 10. Number 8. The Umlawatu Legacy. Naturally, a Cappadocian bloodline would be fairly high on this list. The Umlawatu are a strange blend between the Cappadocians proper with their fascination with the dead, with the anger and bitterness of the Harbingers of Skulls, leaning more towards them in terms of wanting solitude. Their necromancy path makes them stand out enough in my opinion, and their unique culture has made them interesting enough for me to include them in a V5 chronicle. I rate this legacy Scooby-Dooby-Doo out of 10. Number 7. The Impromptu Legacy. The first legacy on this list not to come from Kindred of the Ebony Kingdom, the Impromptu, or the Ishanlogu as some texts call them, are one of the 3 new ones that were introduced in Vampire the Dark Ages 20th Anniversary Edition, where some of my favourite additions to that book and to the V20 line as a whole come from. The strange magic culture surrounding them, almost binding them to their own revenant mage family, the Bomkazi, certainly does create some interesting roleplay dynamics in addition to their own unique necromancy path. Something that I feel makes them a little awkward to roleplay from a storyteller perspective is knowing how to treat the Bomkazi mage, which doesn't make them the easiest to take on as a player character or ST character. Does one rely on Mage the Ascension content, or does one go fuck it and throw caution to the wind? I rate this legacy Steffi Devan Part 2 out of 10. Number 6. The Naglapur Legacy. Whilst they are essentially a more volatile and beastly version of the Tzimisce with perhaps some of the most yikes bit of artwork in Kindred of the Ebony Kingdom, they are the ones with the most research put into them, at least from my uneducated outsider's eye, as the references to real-world myths and legends of Africa have been brought to unlife with this legacy. Being an offshoot of the Fiends, they possess vicissitude, which in Africa is far more dangerous as some of the powers do not require physical touch, which is terrifying to think about. They are the bloodline that scare me the most for this reason, which is why I love them muchly for it. I rate this legacy, the Sheriff in Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines should not be able to do that, out of 10. Number 5. The Zee Dundu Legacy. I won't lie, if it wasn't for the existence of a legacy introduced into V20 Dark Ages and expanded upon in Beckett's Jihad Diary, the Zee Dundu would be considerably lower on this list, for they are very similar to the La Sombra they are spawned from. They exert dominance and control in very similar fashions, and have an interesting origin story, thanks to the aforementioned books expanding upon the little fascinating aversion to physical land presented in Kindred of the Ebony Kingdom. What really shines to me is how alien their breed of obtenebration is, how they and their parent legacy cannot control it as much as the La Sombra can, which gives the most alien discipline new life that no one asked for but something that I love to bits. I rate this legacy Cthulhu Knockoff out of 10. Number 4. The Guruhi Legacy. I love the Guruhi Legacy for how strange they are. I always found it interesting that the rulers of Africa are most like the Ventrue but not the Nosferatu the Guruhi are spawned from. It is also fascinating to me how the Nosferatu weakness has manifested into an aura rather than a physical look, similar to another legacy on this list. The fact they assert their dominance not through dominate, which they do not own, but through presence speaks volumes. It is a louder yet subtler approach to ruling a domain, which is something I rambled about in great detail in my episode about the Guruhi. They also have one of the coolest clan logos in the entire franchise, which is a neat little bonus in my books. I rate this legacy, oh I just can't wait to be king, out of 10. Number 3. The Akananse Legacy. The first legacy you see when you open up the legacy chapter of Kindred of the Ebony Kingdom certainly doesn't miss any punches with what was intended to be a Gangro offshoot but has probably become a Nosferatu or Niktuku bloodline, as I discussed on my lore episode about them and 2 others on this list. They have the most engaging origin story in Kindred of the Ebony Kingdom, a unique discipline that only one other legacy possess, which both of which using a bombre very differently from each other, and the clan weakness of the Akananse is perhaps one of my favourites across all versions of Vampire the Masquerade because of how bizarre it is. They take on the more animal features based on experience, rather with frenzy. I've given a lot of thought about this weird quirk in the blood and continue to do so to this day, which is why they are so far up this list. I rate this legacy a strange Werewolf the Apocalypse reference, out of 10. Number 2. The Bonsam Legacy. Probably a Niktuku offshoot and likely to be a progenitor of the Guruhi Legacy line, everything about this legacy scares me. The weakness making them appear monstrous to mortals, their version of a Bombay being a strange blend of protein and obfuscate with a pinch of presence, and how their curse came not from a vampire but some primordial darkness, according to them makes them pure nightmare fuel in my honest opinion. They are the ultimate hunters in Vampire the Masquerade, and I will stand on that hill until I die. I rate this legacy Hunters Hunted out of 10. Number 1. The Ramunga Legacy. They are the La Sombra but better in every way, from the weakness, from their origin stories, and their culture. Oh, sorry, that's it. That's the critique of the legacy. I rate this legacy 13 out of 10. Once more, we have reached the end of another crappy list that cannot be improved upon, especially when most of the legacies are interchangeably shit and varying degrees of problematic. And with that, roll the outro because I've had enough of this fucking episode. To be kept updated, follow the Law by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we will upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you will be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.